Thanks very much, Nosh. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks again, Noshir, for having me. It's been wonderful so far, and I'm looking forward to conversations with you guys later on. As Nosh said, this paper is called Till Stress Do Us Part, or it's about really processes that link stress communication networks and voluntary exit in a very extreme context. We're going to talk about the Israeli military. This is a paper, a work in progress that myself, Gil Luria from the University of Haifa, and Mina Westman from Tel Aviv University are currently, have actually submitted. So here's the problem. We know that stress leads to voluntary exit. We also know that it costs a fortune. Let me give you some numbers. About 19% of firemen, about 9% of paramedics, these are highly stressful jobs, voluntarily leave their organization. About 14% of the military recruits, according to the USA, voluntarily leave. That's 14%, that's at $46,000 a recruit. That's a lot of money. We also know that about 25% of stress of exit is stress-related, either directly or indirectly. So we're talking about a very large phenomena here. And most theories of exit, of voluntary exit at least, have nothing to say about stress or about the social processes that lead to stress. In fact, most of them kind of say, and there's a beautiful review, a relatively recent review by Steele and Lounsbury in HRMR, reviewing all of the theories and yet saying nothing about networks or how stress might be contagious or how stress might lead to networks, etc., etc. Having said, there is some work about, mostly by David Krackhart and others, that says stress is contagious and communication networks might have something to do with stress and with exits. What we really don't know, however, is what are the processes that actually link stress communication networks and collective exits. In fact, in a recent article, or relatively recent article by Bartonek and colleagues, they have a very strong call that says we should look at these group processes that lead to collective exit. We don't know enough about them. So in a way, there's a link between stress and exit. There's a link between communication networks. We don't know how these three are actually linked together. Our argument's going to be very simple. Well, not very simple, but simple. We're going to say that communication network structure, and we're going to define structure as communication network size and communication network composition, mediate the relationship between stress and exit, and it does this mediation through four processes. The first process is stress-related withdrawal. So basically what we're going to say is that people who are highly stressed will withdraw from their communication network. The second is stress-related distancing, which basically says if I'm stressed, others might withdraw communication from me. The third process is stress-related selection, meaning that if I'm stressed, I'm going to choose other similarly stressed individuals and communicate with them. And the fourth process is stress contagion. This is a quite well-documented process, which basically says if I'm high on stress and I'm communicating with someone else who is lower on stress, over time, he'll catch my stress or she'll catch my stress level. I'll already talk about our analyses. Obviously, this is a complex analysis to do because we want to show mediation. So we're going to use nonlinear hierarchical linear models. That would be for the mediation parts. And we also are looking at how stress and communication networks relate to each other, and therefore we're going to use stochastic act-oriented modeling, Siena. I hope you guys are familiar with Siena. If you're not, I'll give a brief overview of the methodology. So let's build up hypotheses. It's kind of a no-brainer, really, to talk about the relationship between stress and exit. We know that stress is the result of situations in which demands outstrip perceived resources. That goes back to the original formulation of stress by Lazarus. And we know that it has been implied or is directly and indirectly related to about 25% of voluntary exits. It's a very well established link, and it's especially well established in extreme contexts such as the military. There's two beautiful papers by Amadi and by Dilly that talk about stress leading to voluntary exits in the military, in the American military. Therefore, our first hypothesis is really straightforward. We're just saying the more stressed the individual is, the more likely they are to leave. Consistent with a lot of previous research. Our second hypothesis is slightly more complex. We're going to argue that communication networks do a whole lot of things. Basically, they do two things that are relevant to stress and to exits. They embed people in the organization and they provide pre-turnover information. So what are communication networks? There's a wonderful quote by Nosh here. Communication networks are patterns of contact created by flow of messages among communicators through time and space. This is from Monge and Contractor. And these patterns of contacts can be thought of as pipes and prisms, going back to Podolny, through which information is conveyed. It's information, attitudes are changed, attitudes are formulated, and even emotions can actually spread. And why would communication networks be related to anything such as exit? Well, for one reason, because they embed people in networks. Going back to the whole job embeddedness construct, which tried to explain why people stay in organizations, Mossholder and colleagues basically said one of the reasons people stay is because they have lots and lots of communication ties to other people in the organization. So obviously, that's very simple. And therefore, our first sub-hypothesis here is going to be the larger my communication network size, the less likely I am to leave. This is totally consistent with the Mitchell et al. With the whole job embeddedness construct, and there's quite a lot of research, well, not a lot, but there's some research evidence that suggests that this is the case. There's a study by Feely and Bartnett that actually found that isolated and marginalized individuals are less likely to leave. There's a second study by Mossholder and colleague that looked at the number of employees who left in a 5-year period and found that network or communication network centrality was inversely related to leaving. But communication networks do another thing. They actually provide us with information. And this is kind of the line of argument that David Krackhart in the Krackhart and Porter study found, and also Will Phelps found. Stuff flows through these communication networks, and as part of that, I'm exposed to information, pre-turnover information or other types of information. Our second sub-hypothesis here is going to be the composition of my communication network is also going to matter. So if I'm embedded in a communication network in which lots and lots of people are displaying these negative, stressful, whatever type of information, I might actually be more likely to leave. So our second hypothesis is going to be communication network size and composition will lead to exit behavior. Our third hypothesis is going to be one of a mediation. We're basically going to argue, and this is not entirely intuitive, we're going to argue that communication network size and composition mediate the relationship between perceived stress and exit behavior. Why are we talking about mediation here? One of the reasons we're talking about mediation is because we're looking at the generative mechanisms. And if you go back to Barron and Kenny, moderation, mediation, etc., then if you're actually interested in looking at processes, then you're really talking about mediation. So that's kind of a statistical argument, but there's another argument which probably is more theoretical. Stephen Hopeful's conservation of resource theory basically says that what people try to do is they strive to gain, maintain, or avoid loss of resources. For example, social support, communication tie partners, whatever. And Stephen Hopeful describes something that he calls a resource loss cycle, whereby initial resource loss, for example, initial stress, leads to further and further resource losses until I have to do something about it. So initial stress might lead me to withdraw from the network as opposed to seek support, etc., etc. And that's exactly a type of mediation that we're going to talk about. There's also research on social support that suggests that perceived or social support mediates the relationship between stress and exit behavior. Note that we're not measuring support here. We're measuring communication networks. I'm going to argue later that in our incredibly anomic situation, which you'll see in a second, communicating with someone is a type of support. And we also know that stress levels converge over time, and therefore, and I'm going to have more to say about this when we unpack the later hypotheses. So basically, our third argument is going to be, or third hypothesis is going to be, communication network size and composition mediate the relationship between stress and exit. Let's build this link here. That's the link between stress and communication network size. If you go back to Cannon's original description of stress, what Cannon said was, when we're encountering stress, there's two possibilities. We can fight or we can flight. And this flight response is a type of withdrawal, really. Okay, so I'm fleeing, therefore I'm withdrawing from stuff. But there's more research evidence by Driscoll and colleagues, and there's theoretical evidence by Hopeful and Chiron that basically says, conservation of resource theory, I'm stressed, I'm going to withdraw, I'm going to enter this cycle of losses. They call it with devastating effects. Our fourth hypothesis, therefore, is we're going to find evidence for withdrawal. The higher a person's stress level, the more likely they are to communicate less with others in the network. Therefore, the size of their network will shrink over time. Our fifth hypothesis is one that says not only will they withdraw from the network, but others might actually exclude them from communication ties. And there is some evidence that suggests that people who display negative affects are excluded from communication or viewed negatively. This is, I understand Philip Agnesens was here, so there's a beautiful study by Phil Agnesens and Raphael Vitek. And there's another study that actually examined this in the military and said people who are stressed in a very similar setting to ourselves, so Gilurian and Torgeman, said or found that people who are stressed are viewed negatively by others and are accepted less. If that's the case, then we expect them to be also distanced. Note that the first two, hypothesis 4 and hypothesis 5, both link stress with network size, but the agency is placed differently. In hypothesis 4, what I'm doing is I'm excluding communication. I'm responsible. In hypothesis 5, I'm being distanced. The agency is somewhere else. Let's talk about communication network composition and stress. And there are two other hypotheses here. The first hypothesis is one of selection. And you know, the idea of social selection is a very, very familiar one in small group research, cognitive social psychology, sociology. We know that people select similar others, okay, on all kinds of attributes. It's also been theoretically suggested that these processes would work for emotions. There's work by Sigal Barsad who suggested that there is this kind of selection going on in emotions. She's basing her work on the Davis 1981 consensual validation model. It's not been examined in stress, but if it works for attitude, if it works for all these other things, there's really no theoretical reason why it shouldn't work. And it works for emotions, there's really no theoretical reason why it shouldn't work for stress. Our sixth hypothesis is that individuals will select similar others and form communication ties with him. Similar others on stress levels. Our seventh hypothesis is one that will talk about the fact that these things change over time. So whereas selection is I'm choosing someone who's similar to me, and that's why my composition of the network is more or less stressed. The seventh hypothesis says, not only that, I also create more stress in my local neighborhood. There's research evidence coming from what's called crossover studies that says that stress is in fact contagious. All of this research talks about either a dyadic level, so for example, Mina Westman, my co-author, found that stress is contagious between spouses, or at a group level, basically doing an HLM type thing and finding that an individual stress related to the group level stress somehow. We don't have anything that looks at a meso level, basically at a network level. But if this works at a dyadic and a group level, well, we can only think that there should be some mechanism there. And one of those mechanisms would be a mechanism of contagion, which is quite well researched in the network field. Basically, what we're saying is that over time, an individual's level of stress will become more similar to their communication partner's level of stress. I should also say now that this is kind of directional. And the reason that this is directional, so we're saying more stress will lead to contagion, less stress will lead to less contagion. The reason is the whole Taylor negative asymmetry hypothesis, which basically says negative events, negative information are weighed more heavily than positive or neutral information. So if someone's saying to me, oh my God, I'm stressed, this is too difficult all the time, that's actually going to make a stronger impact than if someone says, this is easy. Okay? Just to summarize our hypotheses, Hypothesis 1 said stress would lead to exit. Hypothesis 2 said network size and composition will lead to exit. Hypothesis 3 is the mediation. And hypotheses 4 through 7 talk about the relationship between perceived stress and network communication, network size, and composition. Obviously, two analyses. One of them is going to do this, the mediation. The other one's going to unpack hypotheses 4 through 7. Now's the time to talk a bit. I'll let you watch this for a second.
You cannot carry on if you now care to admit that you are woefully out of your depth. That bell is your salvation. Strike it 3 times and you're out. 3 to get a hot shower and a good night's sleep.
The wonderful masterpiece, G.I. Jane. I'm kidding. But what you see in this small clip is basically the nightmare that our recruits are going through. The setting for our specific study is a 48-hour selection process to one of the all-male elite units in the Israeli military. It's a nightmare. It is a nightmare, and the sole purpose of this huge nightmare, you saw them, I mean, this is kind of stylized, what you saw in the clip, but it's not that dissimilar. Throughout this nightmare, one of the main things that this whole nightmare is expected to do is generate lots and lots of stress to see who falls out. Under the assumption that if people drop out from this, well, clearly they're not suitable for an extreme unit or extreme military service. We have 274 individuals in 17 groups. They're exposed to a variety of stressors through these 48 hours. Some of them are physical. You saw them kind of doing physical activities. They're not that dissimilar to what we have. Some of them are mental. There's lots and lots of mental challenges. People think the army is all about, brawn. It's actually not. So they have navigation and they have really complex problem-solving issues that they cannot do on their own. And this is important. Communication networks are essential to go through these 48 hours of hell. And there are all these social stressors because they're constantly being monitored by others. They're not receiving any feedback on how they're going. Okay? They're just constantly being monitored. They're not allowed to talk to the external world. They're not allowed to talk to anyone in the other groups. So all of the communication is within our groups. As a result, about 96 individuals drop out. There's about a 34% dropout rate. Notice that all dropout is voluntary. No one is kicked out. Okay? We're really talking about voluntary turnover here, or voluntary exits. What did we actually do? So these poor individuals, as they enter the selection process, receive numbers. From there on, they're called by their individual numbers as opposed to by their names. And we measured them 3 times, on stress and on the communication network. So basically, we gave them the perceived stress scale, which is a very well-validated scale, which says, you know, how stressed am I? And we gave them the communication network questionnaire, which basically said, who did you communicate with in the previous hours? 3 time points, one of them about 4 hours in, one of them about towards the end of the first day. The last one halfway through the second day. Of course, these poor recruits don't really know when this thing is going to end. That's part of the other stressors that are playing there. For our mediation hypotheses, we calculated normalized network size. We don't care about whether I communicated with a person or they communicated with me for now. And we calculated, in order to grab the network composition concept, we calculated the proportion of partners with higher than median perceived stress scale scores in the group that I communicated with. So that ranges from 0 to 1, 1 being everyone else in my local neighborhood has higher than median communication network, communication higher than median perceived stress scale scores. 0 says, I'm the only one stressed in my local network. And as I said, we're going to run 2 analyses. The first one is going to be hierarchical nonlinear or logistic model. Logistic because our dependent variable is binary, state or left. And the second one is Snyder's stochastic act-oriented models. Time to show some results. Unless there are any questions. Cool. So what you see here is basically results of 3 models looking at the first hypothesis, the second hypothesis, and the third hypothesis. The first hypothesis was the real no-brainer, which basically said the more stressed I am, the more likely I am to exit, and that was clearly supported. The second hypothesis said the fewer communication network partners I have, and the more my local area is toxic in the sense that these people are all highly stressed, the more likely I am to leave. And that's supported. I mean, it is supported if we're looking at directional hypotheses, which is what these are. It's even almost supported if it's not, 0.054 or something. But our third hypothesis, the mediation hypothesis, basically said we'll find a mediation effect. And notice how under model 1, the parameter for stress, which was significant, becomes non-significant anymore, which basically says we have full mediation. Okay? Hypothesis 3 found that network composition and network size fully mediate the relationship between perceived stress and exit. Now, why would that be, though? How do I get to this communication network size and composition? That's the Siena bit. That's the Siena part of the model. That's this part here. Oops. A really, really brief introduction to Siena, or stochastic act-oriented models. Basically, these models allow for the modeling of a network and attributes simultaneously. We're looking at how changes in the network alter change in attributes and vice versa. It's based on a continuous time Markov process, and where one considers the networks we observed, the 3 networks that we observed, as an outcome of lots and lots of these micro steps. These are theoretical, in which actors have an opportunity to either change a network relationship or not change it. That's still considered a micro change. Or to change their attitudes. Their attributes, so become more or less stressed. And it's estimated with a technique called methods of moment estimation, And I'm not going to go into the technique because that's really besides the point. The main thing to understand, however, is that there are two main functions that the model estimates. The first one is called the rate or the behavioral function, and basically that answers the question of how quickly do these actors get an opportunity to change their ties, that's the rate function, or their behavior, the attributes, and that would be the behavioral function. The core of the model, however, is something that's called the objective function, and that basically you can think about it as what are the theoretical rules of behavior. It's a bit similar to specifying these building blocks and ergons, these parameters. So are we talking about reciprocity? Are we talking about transitivity, et cetera, et cetera? And as part of the objective function, we can also incorporate all these interaction effects of how do network variables interact with individual attributes. So we can talk about an ego effect, an alter effect. So the higher I am on an attribute, the more ties I spread out. Or the higher someone else is on the attribute, the more ties they receive. Or the similarity effect, which is going to model our selection thing. And if you didn't understand any of this is cool, read Tom Snyder's excellent work. Just think a bit of it as a regression. It's a very sophisticated form of regression where the outcome is parameter estimates with standard errors. A parameter estimate twice the size of its standard error is significant. And these effects relate to both network structures, some of them endogenous, some of them exogenous, and to actor attributes. And these are the results. I'm not quite sure you can see them, so let me walk you through them. Our hypotheses are down here. These are things that are actually controls. Some of them are interesting, but you need to incorporate all of these controls in order to get unbiased estimates for what it is that you're actually measuring. Our fourth hypothesis said we'll find evidence for stress-related withdrawal. So if I'm more stressed, I will communicate less over time. This is what's called the ego effect, and as you can see, it is negative and significant, indicating support for our hypothesis. The more stressed individuals are, the less they communicate with others. Our fifth hypothesis was about stress-related distancing, basically saying people will shun others who are more stressed, and there's no evidence for that happening. Our sixth hypothesis, linking communication network structure, in this case composition, and individual stress, is one of selection, which was positive and significant. We're finding evidence that individuals select similar others and form communication ties with them. And our seventh hypothesis is one of contagion, which basically, once again, is positive and significant. We're finding evidence of contagion, so not only do individuals select similar others, they also start this vicious cycle of contagion. There's a few other things that might be, not really. You can look at this, there's a tendency to form cliques, there's a tendency to reciprocation. That makes a lot of sense when we're talking about, communication networks. These are very familiar types of configurations. There's also quite a lot of change initially, so people develop these or have lots and lots of micro steps from the initial point to our second measurement, which again makes a lot of sense. Also consider that there's people who are constantly dropping out. If you didn't understand the model, here's the story in plain English, and I think it's a fascinating story. Individuals enter their selection with their own level, with their own stress level. Higher stressed individuals communicate less with others. That's the withdrawal effect that we found. Those that they do communicate with are also other highly stressed individuals. That's the selection effect that we found. And they catch each other's stress level. That's the contagion effect that we found. As a result, these highly stressed individuals will have smaller networks comprising of other highly stressed individuals, and they drop out as a cluster. It's not a case of individual dropout. In fact, when we draw these diagrams, I didn't show you a diagram, these groups of people, highly stressed individuals, have higher density within. There's a second cluster which has a higher density within and is comprising predominantly low stress individual. The entire high stress cluster, or A lot of the entire high-stress cluster drops out. In fact, these processes explain 81% of the variance in exits. That's quite amazing. The military was overwhelmed at this, because if I know an individual's stress level at hour 6, I can predict 81% of whether they stay or leave, which is pretty impressive. I can also, by the way, predict, this is a different paper, I can predict about 64% of their performance. Okay. Very brief discussion. I guess the first point is that communication networks have a huge effect on people who just met. We're used to thinking about social support. These stronger ties that are well developed and they have trust and they have all these things. In our incredibly anomic situation, it is a bizarre situation. It's a very strong situation. Just communicating with someone might have a very strong effect. So communication networks are important, I guess. The second interesting point here in our study, I think, is that we're used to thinking about an individual's stress and the support they receive. I think one of the things that this research highlights is the fact that it's not just the case of receiving or not receiving support, it's also a case of who you receive support from and what's their stress level. Basically, it's not the case that our highly stressed individuals did not seek support. They sought the wrong kind of support. They sought support from other highly stressed individuals and therefore started this whole vicious cycle of contagion, etc., ultimately leading to their dropping out. This is kind of interesting because it could integrate, by looking at the stress level of others in tandem with my own stress level, this could integrate mixed findings relating to the buffering and reverse buffering hypotheses of stress. There's some research evidence that suggests that stress buffers or support buffers the relationship between stress and various outcomes. And there's other research that suggests that it actually doesn't do that and it increases the relationship. Possibly it's because it's a question of who you get support from. A bit of practical insights. I guess what we're saying is, and I'd be reluctant to call this policy implications, but managers may be in a unique position to intervene and proactively stop the cycle of stress convergence in their group. Basically, what they ought to do is enhance communication with dissimilar, non-stressed others. I should probably say a few caveats here. Look, this is a highly anomic study, a very strong situation. The sample is very homogeneous, which is a virtue and a problem. They're 18-year-old males, all of them, from very high socioeconomic status. This is not necessarily an organizational sample per se. Having said that, I actually think this might be a strength of the study. And I do think that while we examined stress because that was the most relevant thing for our study, I think that these processes might actually work in other settings. Here's how it works. Consider, for example, a person who enters an organization, a work team. And they, for some reason, at time one, have very, very negative attitudes towards their manager. So who are they going to communicate with? Well, they're going to communicate with fewer people over time because they have negative communication or they have negative attitudes. That's the withdrawal effect that we found. They're going to communicate with others who have similar negative attitudes towards the manager. That's the selection effect that we found. And ultimately what's probably going to happen is that they're going to go into this vicious cycle of contagion where their negative attitudes will become more and more and more extreme because they'll be exposed to more and more and more information. The composition of their network will change over time. So while we haven't examined this, I actually think these processes might hold for other attitudes, other emotions, and lots of other things. Ultimately, these processes might lead to exit / being fired / underperforming. So with that, I conclude. Thank you very much.